In this episode of Conversations with Claire, my guest is Tom Gallagher. His career has taken many twists and turns. He practiced law on Wall Street. Then he worked for a large investment banking firm. Then he became a journalist. Then a nonprofit news executive. And today, he's a documentary film producer. Welcome, Tom Gallagher. Where did you grow up and how did you begin your career?
Sure. I come from a big family of 8 kids from upstate New York, and education was a big thing in our family. So after undergrad, I went to law school in Washington, D.C., and then worked my way up to New York and spent most of my professional career on Wall Street as a practicing lawyer. And then for one part of my time there, I moved to an investment banking firm and did business work that wasn't strictly law. I've been a journalist. I've been a nonprofit CEO. Currently I'm producing a documentary on religious pluralism in the United Arab Emirates. And I'm married and I live in southern Connecticut.
What attracted you to the law at first in your career? Because you've had such a varied kind of history and path.
My undergraduate degree was in philosophy. I took a year off and worked in Washington, D.C., and I spent a lot of time walking the halls of Congress as a young college graduate, knocking on doors for a particular nonprofit organization. And many of the staff members at that time were lawyers. And it struck me in those experiences that becoming a lawyer would enhance my kind of innate desire to be an advocate. And so that experience pushed me into the path of taking the exams and applying and attending and getting out. So it kind of evolved out of undergrad.
So here you are, a lawyer working on Wall Street, and all of a sudden you take a different path, a really, really different path. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
So part of my work as a lawyer was helping major nonprofit organizations such as universities, hospitals, health systems with financial transactions. And during that period, I developed expertise and understanding how nonprofits work, how they're governed, how they're managed. And so while I was at a big investment banking firm, I began to advise Mother Teresa's religious order in Calcutta, India, on answering the question how to create a nonprofit organization for the missionaries of charity, which would become the source and expert resource on the life and legacy of Mother Teresa. And what that basically meant is I wrote 1 or 2 memoranda outlining for Mother's successor, Sister Nirmala, who herself was a lawyer, ways in which they could create a nonprofit organization and govern it in a way that included the branches of the missionaries of charity. Most of us know the missionaries of charity because of the women, the sisters, but there's also a group of missionary of charity priests and missionaries of charity brothers. And so the idea was that this nonprofit was going to incorporate these different branches, all founded by Mother Teresa. And then at the time that I left Wall Street, I was invited by the missionaries of charity to actually create this nonprofit. And so I accepted their invitation to help them. And that turned into 2 years of almost 7 days a week of work helping the missionaries of charity bring this nonprofit to life and to animate it and to administer it.
When you think of Mother Teresa, what first comes to mind? I read that your paths didn't cross, but you must know so much about her. Do you feel like you knew her on some level?
Well, yes. So the theme or the idea that comes to mind when I think of her is selfless service to the poorest of the poor. And then because I was so steeped in her life and in her community, I find myself referring to her as Mother or Mother Teresa in a very familiar and intimate way, even though I never met her. So I often will say to people that if it appears like I actually knew her, I didn't, but I've been so engrossed in her life and her work that she feels personal.
Why do you think she was so revered? She certainly wasn't the first person, to dedicate herself, and I think there are other people. But what made her different, special, I would say renowned? She certainly didn't seek it.
No, but the thing about Mother Teresa is that her words and her actions were one, right? So for most of us, we might aspire to live a certain way, in a noble way, in a virtuous way. But for most of us, our inclinations don't always match up to our aspirations. But in the case of Mother, she went and sought out the poorest of the poor. She went to help people who were discarded by society. And so people of all faiths and of no faith find real admiration of her life and her work, because she certainly, walked the talk, as it were. She sought out the poorest of the poor. She went where most people don't go.
I know you give talks about her, and you've spoken in front of many groups about her. How do you use storytelling? That's our focus here. How do you use storytelling to talk about her? And what can you tell us one or two stories that you may bring up during one of your presentations to explain what she was all about?
Sure. So when I think of storytelling, and I think about it for all of us, storytelling is the air we breathe. And when we step back and think about storytelling, every day we're asked to tell stories. And so a neighbor might say, "Hey, how are your children? What are they up to?" Right? And that generates a story about how the children are doing. Or somebody says, "What do you do for a living?" And that generates another story. So story is really the air we breathe. Everybody has a story about Mother Teresa, in whether it's a direct personal story or one they've heard. And so she is filled, she generates stories, all her life, just because of the heroic virtue and her acts of kindness and service to others. One story that Sister Nirmala told, she's now deceased, but Sister Nirmala succeeded Mother in running the sisters globally. But as a young Sister Nirmala was sent to Venezuela to serve the poor there. And during that time, she was learning how to drive a car. And so she was scared to death to drive a car. And so she wrote to Calcutta to Mother and said, may I have permission to not learn how to drive a car, because she didn't want to. And so a couple of weeks later, a letter came back from Mother Teresa, and it said, if Joseph and Mary could learn to drive a donkey, you can learn to drive a car. And so that was kind of a practical, divinely inspired practical solution to Sister Nirmala's apprehension to drive a car. But those stories, are common.
Right. She was, above all things, it sounds like she was a very practical person. But she needed to be, too, right? I mean, that, you're working with the poorest of the poor, and you don't have probably everything you need. You need to be practical.
No, there's another story where she was flying back into Calcutta, and she asked the flight attendants if she could take all the meals that weren't eaten during the flight. And so sure enough, she was able to get all those meals, and they were driven to one of her locations for the poor. She was also very fearless, and her style of leadership was that she always went to the top to ask for something. So she didn't spent a lot of time with middle management. She always went to the top, whether that was the mayor, the governor, the president, or some CEO. So when she thought she needed some support of some kind, she had no hesitation to go to the decision maker and ask for whatever she felt she needed to serve the poor. So we could spend hours just talking about stories about Mother Teresa.
Right. That certainly served her well, actually. I mean, she even did it before she was well known. Once she became well known, I think they would answer the call. But interesting that she did it from the start, go right to the top.
No, that's right. And, one of the things that she did in a lot of communities around the world is that back when HIV and AIDS, became prominent, she would go into local communities and start a home for HIV and AIDS patients. And you can imagine the pushback that neighborhoods, gave. But she would go and she'd work with the local zoning folks and push through the zoning ordinances in order to have a hospice or a home for HIV/AIDS patients. So she was not fearful of public opinion.
One of the most interesting parts of your career and association with the Sisters of Charity is the documentation that you did of the miracles. And, can you just briefly tell us what that's about? There's a tradition in the Catholic Church that miracles need to be documented, and there's a certain amount, and it's collecting research, I believe is what it's called. Tell us a little bit more about your role in that.
Sure. So at the time of my volunteer service, Mother had died, and in the Catholic Church, the process for documenting a miracle happens at the local level where the proposed miracle took place, and it follows two tracks. One track is the medical track, and there, doctors are not asked if a particular healing is a miracle. What doctors are asked is this healing, quote, medically inexplicable? And so when one investigates a miracle, the doctors at the local level have to conclude that they cannot explain why this healing took place medically. And then the second track is the theological track, and that is to say, was the person seeking the miracle or this extraordinary healing, were they praying to one particular holy person? So in this case, was the person praying to Mother Teresa to intervene and to secure extraordinary healing? And why is that? Because if somebody says, my family member was deathly ill with cancer and we prayed for a healing and the family member was healed, and you ask, well, who did you pray to? If the person says, I prayed to St. Francis of Assisi, I prayed to Mother Teresa, I prayed to Padre Pio, well, then on the theological analysis, you wouldn't know who to attribute the miracle to. So you could have the healing be medically inexplicable by the doctors, but you also have to have the theological track conclude that the family was only praying to one particular holy person. So now, in the case of Mother Teresa, there is a miracle of a young couple that I helped investigate. The woman was pregnant. The pregnancy was very, very difficult and troubled. At the time of birth, they expected to take the infant and go into immediate surgery. And so going into delivery, the expectation was that the child was going to be born, but at a high risk of not surviving. So then the child is born and is healthy with no problems. And this defied the x-rays that were taken just before delivery and all the expectations of an emergency. And so the doctors there concluded that it was medically inexplicable. They couldn't figure it out. So it kind of looked like this might be a good miracle. But then as we were talking to family members, and key family members, it turned out they were praying to a variety of saints and holy people, and so that's a case where it looked like a good miracle, and it certainly was a miracle, small m. But for the sake of being evidence that Mother Teresa intervened to help cause a miracle, it could not be used because on the theological analysis, it was not clear.
Yeah, it must be an interesting conversation for you to sit down with the doctors, right? They you went and interviewed them, and what things do they say to you? Because they are people of research and science and facts.
Well, so all the appropriate permissions are secured by the couple involved to have these conversations. And oftentimes, as you would expect, many doctors may not be Christian, or they may not be people of faith. And so you really walk through the science and the medical steps taken, and what were the expected outcomes of this particular path, of medical path, this particular treatment. So on the science side, on the medicine side, it really relies on the technical expertise of the doctors, who are very willing to say they have no idea how all of their X-rays and various tests led them to one expectation, and then at the time of surgery or at the time of delivery, an entirely different outcome occurred. In the case of talking to, say, family members who were praying for a miracle, oftentimes the question is a very simple one. Tell us about this. What happened? And with just a couple of simple questions, a lot of times a family member will just start pouring their heart out, telling their story. And so, and that was the case that I experienced, especially the grandparents talking about the worry of 9 months of worry. So it's not that difficult a conversation because people really want to share.
Yeah, and you are a collector of stories in a sense as you are putting together, I guess it's a document that you present. What's your final presentation that you present back to? Is it the Sisters of Charity so that they can then present it to the church? Is that how that works?
There's something called a positio, or a position document. And so in collecting stories on Mother Teresa's life and trying to determine that, in fact, she possessed heroic virtue, many, many months and years of stories are collected, and people who knew her are formally interviewed, often under oath and through transcription so that there's a record. And all of these stories are gathered. And in the case of Mother, the testimony that was submitted to the Vatican Congregation for the Causes of Saints, it was, 39 volumes, and each volume was about 4 inches thick.
I think I read 300,000 pages is what I read somewhere.
Yes. And so in her case, it was just an extraordinary record that was collected over a number of years to confirm that, in fact, her life was as we all thought it was. She possessed these heroic virtues and lived a very holy life.
Now, as you move through your career, your next path is now from one of a journalist. What attracts you to journalism and I think the teller of stories? I know you're a writer and have written articles for a lot of different publications. Yes,
I picked up a journalism avocation, for many years, and that resulted in 2 stories a month or so that I would write, and there are a lot of stories that local reporters and television reporters just aren't going to have time to pursue. And so I'd like to find stories that are out of the way, aren't going to be front page news, but are stories of people who are doing good things to help change the world. And so I spend a lot of time looking for those kinds of stories, whether it's organization like Engineers Without Borders, going to build wells in poor communities around the world, individual volunteers who work for decades serving a local community. So I try to find those kinds of stories. I was able in 2016 to travel to Iraq and Kurdistan to cover the displaced Christians and Yazidis who got pushed out of Mosul because of ISIS and were living in displacement camps. And so I was glad to get those stories because, the world needs to understand the impact with terrorism. It affects these very innocent people who had to run for their lives on short notice. So I was really glad to travel and to get those stories and to report them.
Yeah. And what attracted you to your latest venture, which is this documentary, you said, on pluralism in United Arab Emirates? So
in 2018, I was in Abu Dhabi, and I was talking to a good friend of mine there. And there, for the first time in we think, hundreds of years, a new Jewish community was being formed in an Arab country, and this is in Dubai. And I mentioned to a good friend of mine, I said, that story really needs to be told. And so in 2019, I began filming and interviewing both in the U.S. and in the United Arab Emirates people and individuals around religious pluralism. And in the United Arab Emirates, there are something about 40 Christian churches. There are a couple Hindu temples. The Mormons have a temple. The Sikhs have a temple. So there's great religious pluralism in the United Arab Emirates. And then, of course, within the last 2 weeks, the State of Israel, the UAE, and the U.S. government signed the Abrahamic Accord, or a peace treaty, if you will, between the UAE and Israel. And so there's an awful lot of good taking place in the United Arab Emirates that many of us in the West wouldn't come across. And so I have a team, and we're developing a documentary to break that story open.
Wow, that's terrific. We need good news, right? We need to hear about everyone getting along, and that's wonderful. That's wonderful. As you set out to do that, what part of that project excites you? Is it the part where you are on site and you're talking to people? Is it when you come back and you're writing, or is it when you get in the edit room and you're putting it all together? I always ask writers and storytellers what part of the process they love.
It's a good question. This is my first documentary, and so the interviews for me are the most enjoyable. But that's just the beginning, right? So once you get, a dozen or 15 interviews shot, you then have to construct a story. And so one of the things I enjoy most is collaborating with my video editor and my chief writer, and really taking words and interfacing those words and those stories with the visuals. And so it's a complicated process, but I enjoy it all at the moment. But certainly the interviewing of subjects and events is one of the parts I like the most. Absolutely.
I always say it's the collaboration in video that is so exciting. if you wanted it to be just a single view, you'd be a writer, but when you choose to take it to a different medium like that and you get everybody's input, right, and hopefully their best work and it all comes together and, you as your vision and your leadership, you have to bring it out of them. So good for you. You have quite a path ahead of you.
Well, Claire, you're absolutely right. And believe me, I don't have the skills that my team has. And so it really is a team effort. I have certain skills, but I certainly don't know how to, really cut video and put it together. So there's a whole,
absolutely,
there's a whole
totally, yep,
group of people you need to bring this to life.
We'll have to follow your journey and ask you back in another, when you get closer to its completion or when it's completed. We will love to follow up with you. That would be exciting.
I'd be happy to come back.
Yeah. So tell us right now, we always ask, what's your favorite story? Or what books are you reading, movies or television shows are you watching?
So as you'd imagine, I'm fully ensconced in the Middle East. And so, one book I'm reading is called Standing for Reason, The University in a Dogmatic Age. And that's by a friend of mine, John Sexton. I'm reading an academic book on Sheikh Zayed, who founded the United Arab Emirates. And then an Anglican priest friend of mine, Andy Thompson, wrote a book called Jesus of Arabia. And so those books just kind of keep rounding me out as I think about this documentary. On the television side, I try to take a break and step out of all of this.
That's good. That's good because it sounds like it's some pretty deep reading. So good for you. Tell me what kind of things you like to watch.
One of my favorites on Netflix is Jacques Pepin and Julia Child Cooking at Home.
Oh, yes. Yes.
I love those two.
Yeah.
And then on Netflix and also on cable, there's a show called Mountain Men, and it's a kind of realistic depiction of different people living out in the wilderness. And then, of course, on the police side, I love Chicago PD.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So just,
eclectic.
You're
eclectic as ever, right? Yeah.
So you asked, but that's kind of how it works out.
That's terrific. Well, Tom, I can't thank you enough for joining us and for telling us about your experience. And we look forward to meeting up with you again as you get down the road with your documentary. And best of luck to you.
Claire, thanks a million. It was great to be with you.